This is K.M. Weiland, and you are listening to the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode, How to Make Every Relationship in Your Story Unique. One of the easiest ways to write an amazing protagonist is to create an amazing supporting cast. This isn't just because great supporting characters will add color, drama, and nuance to a story in their own right. It's also because every supporting character in your story has the ability to bring out new dimensions and complexities within your exploration of your protagonist. The primary way this is done is simply through the relationship dynamics between your protagonist and other characters. Mary Carolyn Davies' famous wedding poem suggests, "I love you not only for what you are, but for what I am when I am with you." Arguability of the notion's simplicity aside, this does offer a perspective on how a person tends to be at least slightly different in every different relationship. Different people bring out different facets of our personalities. And this should hold true for our protagonists as well. I was pondering this recently after experiencing a random memory of the Andy Griffith Show. My family watched this classic sitcom over and over and over again when I was young, so I kind of tend to see the world through a Mayberry-tinted haze. Anyway, not to digress, but my random musing was about how hapless Deputy Barney Fife's every relationship in this show served to bring out a different dynamic within his personality, always to comedic effect. His relatively stable friendship with his boss, Andy, showed him as a mostly respectful subordinate. But whenever he'd deputize the even more hapless Gomer, he'd turn into a mini tyrant. More conscious characters like Andy would rarely bump Barney's fragile ego or antagonize him. But others, like town drunk Otis, refused to play along with Barney's delusions of grandeur and would unhesitatingly initiate schoolyard-esque squabbles. Even Barney's relationship with his official girlfriend, Thelma Lou, was different from the pseudo-suave persona he used with his telephone girlfriend, Juanita. Part of why this example is so fun and obvious is that Barney was an extremely unstable personality who switched personas frequently in order to try to boost or cover up his own raging insecurity. But even with a more mature character, the opportunities are just as fun for dramatizing different facets within different relationships. So, other than just trying to make every relationship different, there are also a few more strategic approaches for diversifying your protagonist's personality via his interactions with other characters. The first approach is that of looking at your story through the lens of three primary characters and their proxies. And this is one of my favorite lenses for examining the roles of characters within plot and theme, and that is to remember there are really only three types of character in any story: the protagonist, the antagonist, and the relationship character. The protagonist is the central character whose actions drive the forward progression of the plot. The resolution of this character's goal in the story or on a smaller scale in any given scene determines the shape of the story. The antagonist is the character or characters or entity who opposes the protagonist's forward momentum in the story or in any scene. And the relationship character is the character who in some way inspires or impacts the protagonist's motives, actions, and growth. Now, obviously, most stories contain far more than just three characters. But if you view your cast through this lens, you will begin to discover the core purpose of any character's role in your story. Theoretically, every character in a tight story will be one of these three, or represent one of the main three by acting as a proxy in some way. The relationship character especially may be divided into different characters who can thematically represent different motivating or driving factors to the protagonist. For example, parent, love interest, child, etc. The second approach is Truby's four-sided conflict. In his book, The Anatomy of Story, John Truby speaks of four-sided conflict, which he illustrates as a rectangle with a different character at each corner and arrows connecting them all. His idea of story's relational conflict is that it should not be isolated to simply the protagonist and the antagonist. Rather, every character in the story should be in conflict, whether large or small, with every other character. This doesn't mean everyone needs to hate each other and be in open war. But even within friendships and loving families, power dynamics, and sometimes outright struggles, are always at play. Even when we are on the best of terms with someone else, we still want something from that person, and that person wants something from us. But what you want from your mother is not the same thing you want from your boss, and what you want from your boss is not the same thing you want from the gas station attendant. The dynamic is different in every case. By keeping this in mind and remembering that all supporting characters are a universe unto themselves with their own burning needs, desires, and weaknesses, same as your protagonist, you can keep tabs on how each unique character might, in turn, bring out something unique in your protagonist. And the third approach is that of parallel characters. Screenwriter Matt Bird uses the term parallel characters to describe how each supporting character should mirror something in the protagonist. You can also zoom this out a bit and examine how each supporting character can represent the thematic premise in a different way. This gives the protagonist the opportunity to interact with many different moral, philosophical, and practical facets of the central dilemma, which can be dramatized via his or her own strong reactions to these other characters. And from there, you can go on to explore 6 different polarities in your protagonist's relationships with supporting characters. And these are 6 simple but powerful dynamics that you can explore by creating unique relationships between your protagonist and every member of the supporting cast. Each is a polarity, a set of opposites. So if you can figure out a way to realistically create competing relationships in which your protagonist alternately plays either role, you might find out some things even you didn't know about your characters. Dynamic number 1 is that of friend and enemy. We all need friends, but most protagonists will find at least a few enemies as well. This is usually the most obvious relational polarity in fiction, since we tend to think of conflict in terms of enemies and allies. Regardless what type of story you're writing and which category is emphasized, be sure you have a fair contrast of both. More than that, consider how your protagonist will interact with each category. He'll be comfortable with a friend character, uncomfortable or even aggressive with an enemy character. One gets his love and devotion, or not. The other gets his resistance, or worse. However high or low the stakes, the protagonist's mode of interaction between these 2 types of supporting character will be wildly different. Dynamic number 2, superior and subordinate. Like our friend Barney Fife, it's likely your protagonist will encounter some supporting characters who are her superiors and others over whom she herself wields authority. How is she different in these different relationships? Is she respectful to both her superiors and her subordinates? Is she more responsible to one or the other? Does one or the other bring out her insecurities and her ego defense tactics? The point isn't that she needs to respond well to one and badly to the other. But if you can emphasize a difference of some kind, you'll find the hidden complexity. Dynamic number 3, attack, defend, and withdraw. These are 3 common relational reactions. Examine which is your protagonist's favorite mode when under pressure. But also examine your supporting characters. If they're all reacting with the same mechanism, that's a missed opportunity for depth. Moreover, there may be reasons why your protagonist or other characters choose different tactics in different scenarios. You don't want to be too random here, but it can be powerfully revealing when a character whose default mode is to attack suddenly chooses to instead withdraw. Dynamic number 4, passive and aggressive. As we explored earlier this year in our lengthy series about the shadow polarities of various archetypes, most unbalanced responses fall into one of two categories, passive or aggressive. Which does your protagonist favor, and which do your supporting characters prefer? Obviously, the passive-aggressive polarity falls into line with the above categorization of withdraw-attack. And I would tend to put the classic designation of passive-aggressive as a third category, in line with defend. Not in the sense of defending healthy boundaries, but rather in the sense of being defensive in a reactionary way. Dynamic number 5, positive and negative. Is your protagonist the type whose initial response is more likely to be yes or no? Does he see his interactions with other people as if the world were half full or half empty? And note that the two questions don't necessarily align. We can throw realist in there too as a third category, although in this context, I would differentiate it as simply someone who is centered and does not use a determinedly negative or positive mindset in a reactionary or defensive way. Characters who favor either positivity or negativity can be used to exaggerated and comedic effect, but played with more subtlety, they can simply be used to challenge your protagonist's moods and views in different relationship dynamics. And dynamic number 6, confident and insecure. So we can't use Barney Fife as an example without bringing up this one. We all have insecurities, although some of us mask them, even from ourselves, better than others. But we can depend on its being a sliding scale. So examine your protagonist and the characters surrounding her. The interesting question isn't so much who is more insecure than the others, but rather how do they each exhibit, cover up, or compensate for their individual insecurities? And how might their insecurities, or lack thereof, interact with other characters' insecurities? Because all characters in a book ultimately arise from one personality, the author's, it can be easy to miss opportunities for adding complexity to your cast. Simply in noticing whether or not every character interacts with the protagonist a little differently, you can begin to observe where your characters may be a little too homogeneous and how you can increase both complexity and realism. Now, I hope you'll stop by the blog and tell me your opinion. How do some of your supporting characters bring out different reactions from your protagonist? If you'd like to be part of the Word Player community over on my site and join in the conversation on this subject, be sure to stop by the site at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com. You can always find a transcript of the most recent podcast and add your voice to the discussion by visiting the first post on the site's homepage. And don't forget that if you're looking for an older post, you can always find those by putting the podcast title in the search field at the top of the right-hand column. If you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe on Apple Podcast, Spotify, and Amazon Music, or whatever your favorite podcast platform may be. And if you'd like to do something to support helping writers become authors, it always means a ton if you're able to leave just a quick rating or review on your site of choice. Also, many thanks to those who support my work on Patreon. Your patronage helps make helping writers become authors and its many resources available to writers everywhere. If you're interested in becoming a patron, you can find out more at patreon.com/KM Weiland. Thank you so much for listening to the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast, and be sure to check back again next week.